Hello, fellow RoboCapitals. Hope you're well. So new GDP data out, revisions from Q3 2025, and you will not believe this. Let's dive right into this Zero Hedge article and check it out. That's right. GDP revised up. Now, for those of you who maybe have been living under a rock or don't pay attention to this economic stuff, the original print 4.3 was, or the last print that we had, 4.3 was extremely high. I mean, you're talking about real GDP adjusted for inflation, not nominal GDP. So the fact that they revised it up is absolutely unbelievable. And to give you some context, this is the highest GDP print that we have had since the end of the cerveza sickness, basically 2023. So let's go over and look at this. This is straight from the BLS. I know it's Zero Hedge, but this is straight from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that comes out with this. Well, we can bounce back and forth between their report and the Zero Hedge article, but basically this is kind of a cut and paste. Okay, now I want you to notice the trend going back to 2024, where we see the trend go down, lower and lower and lower, and we get a negative number in Q1 of 2025. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's front-running tariffs, and because what you have to do is you look at the trade deficit, you've got to subtract that from GDP. And, okay, maybe some of that's true, but again, we're looking at the trend. So why is this important? Because let's go back to a slightly different chart, or let's go over to a slightly different chart. And this is real GDP, but it's measured in a percentage of annual change. So the percentage change from a year ago, and they seasonally adjust it. This is quarterly, where this number that they have from the BEA's website, they Zero Hedge, going back there, this is the annualized number, but it's just the percentage change from the prior quarter, not the prior year. Just wanted to make sure that we're clear on that. But regardless, we'll go back to the other chart here. Regardless, it's all about the trend. So what I want you to notice is when we're going into an economic downturn, you see this going back to the late 80s, the recession we had in early 90s. Check out what happens to GDP. It goes down, 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 down. The trend is definitely lower. And we see that with .com. We see that for sure with the GFC. I mean, the trend started to decline back in 2004, for heaven's sakes. And obviously, we see it drop off a cliff during the cerveza sickness. Now, if you look at the labor market, and if you look at the comments of my videos, or you talk to your friends and family members, I'm sure the majority of you would say, look, George, I don't care what this GDP number is. The economy is not booming. The economy is really, really, really struggling right now. We might not be in a recession. I don't know. But just my lived experience tells me the economy is really, really, really doing poorly, maybe even an economic contraction. So this makes sense where you see this down, or this trend declining from, call it Q4 of 2023 down to where we were Q1, where we actually had that negative number based on the other calculations, the quarter percentage change, where we had that negative number. But what doesn't make sense is now we see this reverse, this trend completely reverse to the point where now it's really accelerating. I mean, not just reversing, it's accelerating when you look at this going from a negative number straight up to almost 4%, then up to today where we get the revisions at 4.4%, which again is the highest real GDP number we have had since 2023. So this, I mean, there's no doubt, there's no getting around it. This is an incredible number. And it has a lot of people speculating that, oh my gosh, 2026 is going to be amazing. We're going to have emerging market economic growth. It's going to be like 5, 6, 7, 8% in real terms with all these pro-growth policies. And then you look at how amazing the Trump economy is, and it's performing these economic miracles that are completely inexplicable. And if you didn't have the labor market, which, by the way, is the elephant in the room, and you just had this to go on, I totally see how you could come to that conclusion. But you guys know from watching my videos and just good old-fashioned common sense that you can't just take one metric and base your entire analysis on the economy with this one indicator. You've got to look at everything. And the other huge indicator we have to look at is, of course, the non-farm payrolls, the labor market. But it's not just that. Then we also have to look at things like AI capex spend. And we have to look at something that I've never heard anybody talk about, but I think it's really important that we include this in our analysis. And it's what I call the price swap. The price swap illusion, I think, is even a better term. And I'll explain that here in just a moment. But just as a reminder here, let's look at non-farm payrolls. And I want to start by looking at, we'll call it the 1980 or so to 2019. Now, I can't include the survey sickness because then it skews the chart and you can't even see what's going on. But look at what happens when we go into the recession. Usually you have consistent negative non-farm payrolls. Okay, got it. Now, it is true that outside of recession, you will see this occasionally, but then you see this big bounce back. And why is that? Because usually it's because of an extreme weather event or a huge employer like Walmart. Everyone strikes or something like that. So you see a negative 100,000, but then the next month you see a positive 100,000. And it's just so on net balance, there's really no change. But what you see also heading into an economic contraction is the trend going down along with real GDP. You see the trend going down here. It looks very similar to that real GDP chart that we looked at earlier. So why is this important? Because now let's look at more recently, and this is without final revisions here, guys. We see consistent negative non-farm payrolls in 2025. And remember, Jerome Powell came out and admitted, or he said that by the Fed's own metrics, that he thinks the non-farm payrolls are being overstated by about 60,000 jobs per month, which if you look at the last 6 months, would take the average to a negative number. So the point is here, you don't see negative non-farm payrolls, typically, especially consistently, outside of an economic contraction. It's very rare. So what we have here is a labor market that completely disagrees with nominal GDP, or excuse me, with real GDP, or vice versa. So how do you reconcile this? Like, how do you connect the dots? How do you make sense out of any of this? Well, first of all, it's something that I'm sure you guys have heard many times, but it's definitely applicable here. It's the K-shaped economy. And this is an article from Lance Roberts, and he does a show every Saturday with my good buddy Adam Taggart on Thoughtful Money. And he has a chart here, a fantastic chart from TradingView. And this really, because we all know what the K-shaped economy is, but when you see a visual representation, I think the impact is far more powerful. So check this out. We've got the blue line is the University of Michigan survey. So I know a lot of people say, oh, well, the Democrats skew that. Okay, fine, but we're going to look at it during Biden as well. And then the red line represents the S&P 500. Now, look at the extreme here. So this black line, this vertical black line, is the survey sickness. And then the black line going up here, that's basically following the S&P 500, which is the red line. And the black line going down is following the blue line, which is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. Look at this, guys. I mean, is that powerful or what? And look at, they're almost tied at the hip, going back to the GFC, right? And all of a sudden you get the survey sickness and they just diverge massively. And the divergence continues to get more and more extreme. So it's very true that you can have positive real GDP that is completely propped up and dependent on the top, let's say 10% of people who are just spending money like it's going out of style. We used to have a different way to say that, but we'll keep it child friendly here. So they're spending money like it's going out of style. They're popping bottles. They're buying Lambos. They're flying first class. They're buying Louis Vuitton. They're doing all these things which is such a massive amount of spending that it's actually compensating for the lack of spending with the bottom 90%. But I don't think that explains everything. Now, just to back up this point before we move on to the AI capex spend, and then that very important kind of price switching, we'll call it. Let's go over to right here. So you guys have heard the rhetoric from Trump lately. He wants to ban institutional investors from buying houses. Why? To make them more affordable. He's trying to pull down interest rates, make them more affordable. Look, if the economy is booming on all 8 cylinders, would he really need to go to these extremes prior to midterms? Probably not. And you see a consistency here with the policies he's trying to push. Right here, he's trying to put a cap on credit card interest rates. Well, who does this apply to? Is this applying to the rich people who own assets that are popping bottles? No, they're not. They might be using their credit card, but they're paying it off every single month. The credit card interest rate doesn't really affect them at all. And we go even further. We look at corporate America, and we see right here, Delta saying the rare airline, Delta's the rare airline doing well because it's catering to the rich. Also, you go a step further, you look at Macy's, which, here it is. No, did I delete that? Yeah, I guess I did. Okay, so Macy's, what they are doing is they're coming out and saying that they're doing this whole new shift, a big change. The retail people are calling it just a bold strategy, where they're starting to close down stores, but they're also starting to cater to the luxury spender or the luxury consumer, as opposed to more so kind of the middle class or maybe the upper middle class like they used to do. Why? Because those are the only people spending money. So if you look at the rhetoric from the Trump administration, you look at what corporate America is saying, you start to see that, oh, that chart, it makes a lot of sense, that K-shaped economy chart. Okay, so now let's go over to some other kind of conflicting information, but I think when you think it through, it actually makes sense. So that would be metal prices. So gold and silver, I think those are trading on something outside of economic fundamentals. But you look at Dr. Copper. I mean, look at a chart of Dr. Copper. This would definitely back up what we're seeing with nominal GDP, and it would contradict what we're seeing in the labor market. But then you got to think through capex spend. And we know that that's been billions, possibly trillions of dollars. And that's going to put a lot of upward pressure on the copper prices because the supply just isn't able to increase at that breakneck speed that the AI, the data centers, are actually using all of the copper wiring. So that slice of GDP is definitely growing, and it's adding to what we're seeing in the overall number, the headline number. But does that that little teeny slice, although it does impact a lot of Americans, what, 1, 2, 3%? So it makes sense that the other 87%, let's say, are really, really struggling, where Dr. Copper this time around isn't really representing the average Joe and Jane. It's just more so representing that headline number. Okay, now let's go over to, well, I don't know how I would give you a representation of this, but if we look at the delta, let's go over to, well, we'll just go back to GDP. So this number that we're getting, this 4.4%, this is in real terms. So they're adjusting for inflation. They're using a deflator. Okay, well, let's think this one through. There are fewer imports coming into the United States. So people are buying more American products than they used to. So now a lot of you might say, well, this is a great thing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll save that for the topic of a separate video. But what this means is that if you're buying US versus what you were buying through China, you're likely paying a higher price. Okay. But let's say that you've got let's say in 2023, you had the option of buying widget A for $1 or widget B, which is the exact same widget, but just made in America, for $2. Okay, great. You've got those options. Well, now you might just have one option, the widget B that costs $2 that's made in the United States, because widget A is no longer being imported into the United States. Now, if you look at the deflator, and I'm sure they use substitutions, but it's not that accurate. So if you look at just the deflator, it's picking up the only widget that's being purchased, and it's saying it's likely coming to the conclusion that, oh, well, there's no inflation. No inflation. Look, it was $2 in 2023. It's $2 today. So this item hasn't gone up in price. But the option for the item at 50% lower cost is no longer there. You see? So when you look at, and I'm just throwing out numbers here. These aren't exact numbers. I'm just using them for the sake of the example. So let's just say that nominal GDP is at 5%. And if you used a deflator based on widget B, it only goes down. It only goes down to 4% for real GDP, blowout number. But then if you actually look at it through the lens of the average Joe and Jane that has to spend an extra dollar, has to spend 100% more on what they buy at Walmart, let's say, then it's, oh my gosh, they're spending more. This is going to be picked up in nominal GDP, but it isn't deflated out to get the real GDP number. And then you look at it with the people who own assets, and they could care less, because although they might have to pay an extra dollar for that widget they buy at Walmart, they don't care, because that day they made an extra $1,000 on their 401k because their portfolio went up by 5% or something like that because of the S&P, NVIDIA, whatever happened. So I think this switching, this price change or price switching from widget A to widget B is one of the reasons why the lower 90% are so fed up, and why their purchasing power is getting squeezed, and why it might not really be reflected in real GDP, but it's definitely being reflected in the labor market with aggregate demand in terms of volume of widgets sold going down. So I think the main takeaways there, guys, is one of these numbers is right. Now, you may completely disagree with me. I think it's likely the labor market, but who knows? I could be wrong. But at some point, they have to reconcile. You can't have negative non-farm payrolls for, throughout, let's say it continues throughout 2026, and the economy growing at 5 or 6% in real terms. That dog don't hunt. So you tell me, what do you think is going to happen? Is real GDP going to come back down to the labor market, or is the labor market going to go back up to real GDP? I don't know. And on that bombshell, guys, I'd like to remind everyone that we just started selling tickets to Rebel Capitalist Live, where you can get a lot of these questions actually answered by the people that are a hell of a lot smarter than I am. That's for sure. People like Mike Green, Jeff Snyder, Brent Johnson, just to name a few. In fact, Darius Dale is going to be there as well. Super excited to have him there for the first time. So if you want more information on the speakers, the past speakers, what Rebel Capitalist Live is all about, or getting your tickets, you got to get your tickets now because the price goes up the closer we get to the event. We'll have Josh put a link in the chat, and he'll put a link in the description below. So check that out, guys. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in Orlando at the end of May 2026. We'll see you there.